Hey, hello everyone. Christopher Ford from the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign. Thank you very much for joining us tonight for this fantastic forum we have lined up on an introduction to the history of Ukraine. The Ukraine Solidarity Campaign has been quite distinctive in our campaigning around the current war which is taking place following the broader Russian invasion of Ukraine. And one of our main arguments has been around the need to appreciate the historical context of Ukraine and its relationship with Russia, which the current conflict is set in. In order to help us address that, we're hosting this event tonight to invite the labour movement to engage with us. And we have a fantastic speaker tonight, which is Professor John Paul Himka, who is an author of many books on the history of Ukraine. His books include Socialism in Galicia. He was the editor of Roman Rozdolsky's wonderful book, Engels and the Non-Historic Peoples, the National Question in the Revolution of 1848. And more recently, John Paul Himka is the author of Ukrainian Nationalists and the Holocaust, Un Adopas Participation in the Destruction of Ukrainian Jewry. John Paul has also an article on our website, which I would refer anyone to link up on, the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign website, which is an outline history of Ukraine. So without hanging on, I'm going to plunge straight into the seminar. We have a fantastic panel here tonight as well. We have Mick Antoniew from the Welsh Assembly from the Labour Party. We have John Maloney, who's Assistant General Secretary at the Public and Commercial Services Union. We've got Paul Inglis, who's also a Unison member. And we have Angela Patton from a member of Unite Community, who are both from Scotland and supporters of the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign. And we're joined live from Kiev by Vladislav Starodubtsev, who's a supporter of Socialny Ruch, our friends and comrades in Ukraine. So, John Paul, I'm going to hand over to you now. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank you, and I want to thank everybody on this panel. I didn't quite realize I was in such august company as I am, so I'll do my best to try to live up to the rest of you. I also want to say, Chris, how much I appreciate all the work you've done on the history of Ukrainian socialism and Marxism, and all the work you've done connecting all of us with the labor movements and the socialist movements in contemporary Ukraine. And I think the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign is just a wonderful initiative and really needed, and has bailed out our thinking more than once. So thank you again. What I'm going to do is try relatively quickly to go over Ukrainian history. Now, on the website, there's one fairly short history of Ukraine that I wrote called 10 Turning Points. And Chris mentioned that at the beginning. And you can find it there, and you can read it in about an hour, maybe a little bit more. And it gives an overall history of Ukraine for 1,000 years. So instead of 10 turning points, I'm going to do 3 talking points. What I'm going to do is take 3 themes and just talk about them, and hopefully, as a result of this, some idea of Ukrainian history will come through. So I'll be talking about these 3 topics in this order. First, about serfdom. Second, about Russia. And third, about NATO. I know NATO doesn't really have a lot to do with Ukrainian history, but it's always, people say it's NATO, it's NATO, it's NATO. I want to talk about that. But first, I want to start with serfdom. Serfdom as a major component of Ukrainian history is, I see that I'm not seeing properly, okay. Serfdom as a component of Ukrainian history. I feel it's a very important component. In the kind of normal national narrative of Ukrainian history, it doesn't really figure much. However, it is very important in the Marxist understanding of Ukrainian history. Roman Rozdolsky, probably our most brilliant socialist thinker, wrote quite a bit about serfdom in Ukraine and its impact on the country. So I want to start there. serfdom, and it's a special kind of serfdom, existed in Ukraine from 1500 until, depending on the part of Ukraine, either 1848 or 1861. So basically 350 years, 350 years. And for me, it's living memory. I didn't even know the word serfdom in English, and my grandmother talked about panshchina and about serfdom. And she learned about it from her grandparents, and I learned about it from my grandparents. Now, if I pass it on, it's just family stories, but it was living memory in our family. It wasn't serfdom, people don't really understand what serfdom was like. Especially this was called second serfdom. It was a form of serfdom as different from medieval serfdom as New World slavery was from slavery in antiquity, because it was formed in a period of capitalist economy, explorations and colonization of the rest of the world. It was not exactly the same serfdom that had existed earlier. In fact, it was a much more intense kind of serfdom, and it's called by historians second serfdom. And it relied on the labor of peasants, the serfs, to produce enough grain so that it could be sold out of the port of Gdansk and sold to the rapidly expanding West European economies. Spain came back from the New World with silver and gold. Capitalist relations in Western Europe were creating new kinds of wealth. And instead of people farming for all their own food, they were buying them on the international market. And Ukraine and Poland were major producers of grain. When they talk about Ukraine being a breadbasket of Europe, you have to realize that this was done under very specific conditions. It was done under the conditions of the virtual enslavement of the population. In Ukraine, and for that matter in Poland, serfs paid rents in three forms: in labor, kind, and money. So I'll come to labor in a minute. But rents in kind, if you had honeybees, you had to give over a certain amount of honey. If you had sheep, you had to give out a certain amount of sheep you paid in rent. Always the number of eggs that had to go to the manor. All these kind of little things. Cloth, you had to weave cloth for the manor. Numerous in kind. And also you had to pay money. And it wasn't a money economy, but the peasants had to find ways to make money. One way was through the purchase of vodka, which was actually one of the duties of serfs, was to buy a certain amount of vodka every year, a barrel or so. And that way they paid for it with money, and that money went to the landlord. But it's rents and labor, which is what's most important to understand. Rents and labor means that the serfs worked 3 days a week, generally speaking, 3 days a week on the manorial estate, and only the rest of the week on their own land. So this was forced labor, because it was certainly not voluntary. There was certainly no recompense for it. In fact, you were paying to do this labor on the lord's estates. And the only way it could be enforced was through violence. So if a serf didn't want to work, then that serf would be taken to the stables, put in chains, and beaten, and then would be let go to work. So it was a very brutal system, in some ways reminiscent of slavery in North America and the Caribbean, except for the difference that they had their own land, small plots where they fed themselves. So the serfs made their own food and then did the slave labor for the landlords. This economic system produced all kinds of consequences. One of them is the growth of the Cossacks. Ukraine is famous for the Cossack population that it had. many of these Cossacks were runaway serfs. They were people escaping the onerous conditions in serfdom back on their own land and running into the steppe to escape it. And running into the steppe at this time, which was controlled by Tatars, and the Tatars in the steppe would catch anybody they could and sell them into slave markets to the Ottoman Empire. So it was rough going to escape to the Tatar steppe, and those who did it eventually began to band together, form military units, build little fortresses, the most famous one being the so-called Zaporozhian Sich, where the Cossacks were gathered. And these runaway serfs, and also adventurous, young noblemen, became a formidable force in Europe. So many people were escaping from this situation. This was not possible, let's say, for the African slaves in North America. There was no place to escape to, except maybe occasionally to the Everglades in Florida, where there was an Igbo village in the 19th century. But normally, these kind of violent forced labor situations don't allow for escape. Peasant revolts. Peasant revolts were quite common in the 17th century, and again in the 18th century, and again in the 20th century, because the conditions of the peasantry were difficult. Let me just try to, for a second, paint the life of a peasant. The life of a peasant was every day up at dawn, and everything you consumed, you made, with the exception of vodka. Everything you consumed, you made. You made your own clothing out of the hemp you grew. You made your own food out of what you grew in your garden and out of what you grew on your little plots of land, from what your chickens produced. Everything you made yourself, in addition to working several days a week at the landlord's estates. In this period of serfdom also came a very important ethnic and economic stratification. So the merchant class, the leaseholding class, was largely and deliberately formed by Jews. Jews who lived differently than the rest of the population, with their own diet, their own clothing, their own economic ways. They had been specifically invited into Poland as economic developers. And the serf system relied on them to do certain functions, such as making vodka, selling vodka, adding tolls to the roads, managing the estates, making sure that the peasants were doing their jobs. So they were part of that manorial system. And there were no Poles doing this. There were no Ukrainians doing this. This is almost all Jewish. And people who married into that, they would become Jewish. People who married out of it would become Ukrainian or Polish. The upper class was largely Polish. Even if they were originally of Ukrainian origin, the high culture was Polish, education was Polish, the government was Polish, and the upper classes assimilated to Polish culture. So, and the peasants, whether they came from, and we know that the peasants sometimes had Tatar or Jewish origins because of their names, we know that. But all of them adopted the Ukrainian language. Poles who moved into the Ukrainian territory as serfs, they also adopted the Ukrainian language, even if they retained their Roman Catholic faith. So the key formation of Ukrainian society was these serfs. This had an impact, for example, on language. The Russian language is quite different from the Ukrainian language. People who grew up in a bilingual Ukrainian-Russian environment don't realize it, but in fact, they're not very mutually comprehensible. Ukrainian and Polish are easier to understand. My grandmother, who is Ukrainian, and my stepmother, who is Polish, always conversed with no problems in Polish and Ukrainian. One spoke Polish, one spoke Ukrainian, no problem. When I brought my wife, who was raised to speak Ukrainian, to Moscow, she couldn't understand the word they were saying, and they couldn't understand the word she was saying. So they're different languages. But this comes out also of that socioeconomic system that I described. These things really impact culture more than we believe. So the Russian language is started out as a largely written language that adopted many features of Church Slavonic, Bulgarian in it. And it was a very formal language, a language that had an upper class because Russia had its own Russian upper class. In where the serfs were concerned, they didn't have much writing, and the Ukrainian language as we know it developed as a vernacular language, a language that people spoke among themselves, not one that was kind of framed in a written discourse as Russian. There are no transitional dialects between Ukrainian and Russian because one is a vernacular language of poor people, and the other is a language that actually had a state, monasteries, and other things behind it. Cultural impact. Coming out of serfdom slows down your cultural development. Ukrainians sometimes develop an inferiority complex, and then they overcompensate, say, such and such of our writers is the greatest writer of the 20th century or something like that. But it's because they come from humble origins. You know, there's not really a long tradition of a written culture, of universities. They were very much stepchildren within the Polish state. And the other thing that was very formative of this period of serfdom is Ukrainian politics. When Ukrainians, like many other submerged nations, like the Scots, for instance, began to really work on their history and then develop kind of politics and a national view in the 19th century, almost all the people that were the adherents of this nation were serfs or recently emancipated serfs. So Ukrainian politics was always based on the peasantry for a very long time. And it meant that they were always with the progressive side of the political spectrum for a very long time. The major Ukrainian political thinker of the 19th century, Mikhailo Drahomamov, he said, in Ukraine, the lower class is all Ukrainian speaking. If you're educated Polish, educated Russian, you have to also pay attention to Ukrainians who are there because they are the future. They are the ones that will be liberated. They are the ones who are the nation. So it's coming out of this kind of, and in the 19th century, I have to say, it was a time of very progressive ideas. You know, Marx, Bakunin, all those guys and girls were writing in the 19th century and creating a space. And Ukrainian politics fit into that space because it was the politics of a plebeian nation, of a nation that didn't have a real upper class. The highest class was, there were some Cossack gentry, most of them were Russified, and there were priests. That was it. So I want to emphasize that the Ukrainian history comes out of an unenviable place. It's an unenviable place. And there's a lot of other unenviable things that happened during that whole period, but I just want to point that out. So a Putin or somebody like that says there is no Ukrainian culture, there is no Ukrainian nation. Well, part of that is because it was really submerged. It was really submerged. Now I want to go to my second talking point, which is Russia. Russia and Ukraine have common origins in the state of Rus, Kievan Rus, which existed in the from the late 10th century, or even earlier. You can probably count it from the mid 9th century until the Mongol invasion of the 13th century. All of that was Rus. It was a common culture. It adopted Eastern Christianity from Byzantium. It had a very common written language with, local features depending where it was written, and a shared dynasty. And this is what many Russian nationalists look to as the cradle of all the Russian civilization, including the Ukrainian civilization. And Russia, in fact, is just a Latin name for Rus. But Ukrainians also use the name Rus till actually some of them in the Carpathian Mountains still use that name for themselves today. So there's been a continuity all along. But after the Tatar invasions of the 13th century, Ukraine ended up in Poland or Lithuania, or Poland-Lithuania. I don't want to go into that complicated history. And what's today Russia developed in Muscovy. It was an independent country. It paid taxes to the Mongols, but it wasn't under foreign rule in the sense like the Ukrainian territories were, which were under Polish rule. And the difference is culturally significant because while Russia developed as a state, it could have huge monasteries, which had libraries, scriptoria, icon painting workshops, while in Poland, the government did not do much to support the Orthodox faith of the Ukrainian people. And they developed differently. So under Poland, Ukrainians adopted a lot of Polish words for their concepts, which is why Polish and Ukrainian are so easy to understand each other today. While Russia developed a writing system based very much on the Church Slavonic language. People often think of Ukraine as part of Russia. But in fact, Russia was not even involved in Ukrainian affairs until 1648. So a lot of time passed before Russia became involved in Ukrainian affairs. And that was as a result of a Cossack rebellion led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky, Cossack leader, who, seeking allies, went to put himself under the protection of the Tsar of Muscovy. And so it's really relatively late. And when the Cossacks became, and it wasn't all of Ukraine, it was only up to the Dnipro River. So half of Ukraine was under Russia in 1648. It was very useful to Russia in that period where it was within Russia as a kind of independent, or not independent, but a kind of a Cossack polity within Russia, before Russia became centralized, before Russia became truly modernized. So the Ukrainians under Poland, some of them had gone to Jesuit universities. Many of them had learned new skills, and in Kiev, the Cossacks had founded they had supported a institution of higher learning, which was the highest educational establishment within the entire Eastern Orthodox world, the Mohila Academy. And the educated Ukrainian clergy became bishops throughout Russia, so they served, they helped a lot in bringing education to Russia. and they staffed all the choirs in St. Petersburg because they sang polyphony, which they learned under Poland. And they were important defenses, the Cossacks, against the Tatar Khanate in the south, which made regularly slave raids to the north. And also they were useful in war with Poland, since Cossacks have always been fighting Poland. Not always, but often fighting Poland. As long as Poland existed, as long as the Crimean Khanate existed in the south on the steppe, the Cossacks were useful to the Russian state. But when Poland was partitioned at the end of the 18th century and disappeared from the map, when Russia conquered the entire north shore of the Black Sea at the end of the 18th century and destroyed the Crimean Khanate, Cossacks were no longer useful. And that great modernizer of Russia, Catherine II, began to centralize the state, get rid of the Cossack regiments, which had been formerly existing, integrating everything into a single Russian state. In the middle of the 19th century, the same time, as I say, many other submerged nations were collecting their folklore, making up a history, I guess that's the way we could say it, inventing tartans and other things like that. There was also a Ukrainian awakening in Russia. The famous bard of Ukraine, Taras Shevchenko, born a serf, wrote a book that just electrified the readership of the mid-19th century, because it was the first time somebody had spoken who was a serf in such a powerful poetic language. And he wrote in Ukrainian. He was exiled because of his political opinions. He got involved with some characters who thought that they should abolish serfdom and have a democracy and a federation in Russia. That didn't work very well, so he ended up in the East. But his persecution and many other Ukrainian cultural activists were persecuted in the 19th century and early 20th century in Imperial Russia. Russification was the norm. There were restrictions on publication in the Ukrainian language. In the 1860s and 1870s, laws were issued that prohibited certain kinds of Ukrainian publications, and really very little was published in the Ukrainian language. There was a total ban on education in the Ukrainian language in Russia, never lifted under the imperial authorities. So all children who were lucky enough to get an education in one of the most backward countries of Europe, they were educated in the Russian language. Ukrainians were not considered inorodцы, it's a Russian term, like Jews or Tatars, I don't know, aliens, I guess we could call them. They were considered, along with Belarusians, to be Russians, more or less. They had their peculiarities, but they were basically Russians. And they were persecuted not as an ethnic group, but as an identity. So you could be a Ukrainian by ethnic origin, and as long as you didn't, try to use the Ukrainian language in publications or try to be involved in Ukrainian activism, you were okay. You wouldn't really suffer. But the minute you began expressing and asserting a separate identity, well, that could lead to prison, that could lead to exile, that could lead to all kinds of negative consequences. And then there was the Soviet period. Of course, there were then 6 years of war after the collapse of, or many years of war, 1914 to 1920. Terrible time in Ukraine, just terrible time. In the Soviet period, there was a brief period, actually about 6 years, of so-called indigenization when Ukrainian culture was actually fostered within the Soviet Ukrainian Republic. But in 1930s, that came to an end. Already there was a big show trial of Ukrainian cultural figures in 1930. And throughout the 1930s, almost every prominent Ukrainian cultural activist was not simply exiled, not simply arrested, but was actually executed. There was a reduction of Ukrainian culture to kind of a folkloric provincial status under the Soviets from the 1930s on. Reduction of Ukrainian book and periodical publication. I remember once I was in Kyiv in the Soviet period, and I went up to the kiosk and I said in Ukrainian, I said, please give me a copy of Вечерний Kyiv, which is the Ukrainian evening newspaper. And the woman in the kiosk said, "Это на украинском." She, like, why would I buy this? This is in Ukrainian, she said, because it was so unusual to get a Ukrainian newspaper. Real reduction of Ukrainian language education throughout Soviet Ukraine, especially since the end of the 1950s. Industrialization and urbanization meant that Ukrainians moved to the cities, and with it, they lost their peasant language and began speaking like real humans, the Russian language. And I would say, if you want to understand the current war, probably the most important thing to realize is that Putin's aim is to build on this previous Russification and to destroy a separate Ukrainian national identity. I think this is the major war aim. You know, if you have time, it's worth reading Putin's screed, his essay of 12th of July, 2021, where he talks about the unity of the Ukrainian and Russian nation, or listen to his speech on the 21st of February, 2022, where he just denies that there's, you know, a separate nation here that's being submerged and a separate identity. And what he's done is it says, well, if you have a separate identity, you must be a Nazi. No, it's ridiculous. You know, my grandmother was a Nazi because she didn't have a separate identity from a Russian? I don't think so. But this is, I feel, the major war aim is the subjugation of the Ukrainian state within the Russian sphere of influence and the destruction of a separate Ukrainian identity. I see I'm going a little over time. I'll just be quick about NATO. I want to do NATO because everybody's talking about NATO. I don't think the war is about NATO, though NATO has been an aggravating factor. My own position on NATO is extremely negative. I'll just say two words: Afghanistan, Libya. The NATO expansion in the 2000s was part of George W. Bush's imperialist policies. It's, you know, making America stronger, making it the monopolar ruler of the world. But it was also welcomed by the East European states. That NATO membership was welcomed by those states because of the threat of Russia. And that kind of crisis reached a higher point in 2008 when the US recognized Kosovo, which was something the Russians didn't want. So the Russians invaded Georgia in 2008, and Ukraine applied to NATO. But Ukraine then pulled out of the application to NATO, and NATO was actually not interested in getting Ukraine. After the invasion of Crimea and the Russian support for the Donbass separatists in 2014, the Ukrainian government renewed its aspirations to join NATO. And it actually is now, I guess, in the Ukrainian constitution that it wants to join NATO, but it's not going to happen. NATO figured prominently in Putin's bellicose talk on the eve of war, but I noticed NATO is not an actual combatant. It's not fighting there on Ukraine's side, and it's not being attacked from Russia's side. NATO countries arm and support Ukraine to a certain extent, but so do non-NATO countries. Quite a few non-NATO countries that are helping Ukraine right now in this war against Russia, for the very simple reason that there shouldn't be an international order which just lets one country invade another for absolutely spurious reasons. And, you know, if NATO has a dog in every conflict around the world, you then have to imagine that NATO controls the world. But it's like walking on a beach with your shoes on. You're bound to get sand in it. If you do anything, NATO will be there, pushing its own agenda. NATO isn't what this war is about. Ukraine has offered to refrain from joining NATO, and this has not mollified Russia in the least. And if anybody is making NATO popular in Ukraine, it is precisely Putin's Russia. So here's the statistics. Before 2014, before the invasion of Crimea, before the support for the separatists, about 25% of the Ukrainian population wanted to join NATO. There's different polls, some say 30, some say 17, 25 is a safe estimate. After the invasion of Crimea, support for NATO in Ukrainian population grew to 45%. And now, in early 2022, about 70% of the population of Ukraine wants to join NATO. So Putin is NATO's absolutely biggest recruitment officer. So I think it's a sideshow in this. I think what we're seeing here is a war to reassert an imperial kind of suzerainty over a nation which really wants to be independent. And I'm sorry it took so long, but we can now open the floor, I guess.
John Paul, thank you very much indeed for that wonderful presentation. So, many people have joined us tonight. You can submit questions through the chat. We will gather as many questions as possible and put them to John Paul so you can get a response. We're also going to invite some questions from our panelists. And the first person we're going to ask is Mick Antonov.
Okay, well, Paul, thanks for that summary, which is fascinating, interesting, and I think reflects some of my own experience from family discussions over the years as a second generation Ukrainian. Just wanted to follow on your theme a little bit, and that is, of course, we go back to Russian Empire. Russian Empire then effectively supplanted by Soviet Union. Within both of those, Ukrainians very much the Malorus, Little Russians, or the Hochols, the sort of, I suppose, really the sort of the historic categorization of Ukrainians as somehow a sort of diminished, you know, and being a representative in Wales, I understand what it's like having a small country with a sort of unpredictable larger neighbor, etc. Putin now and Greater Russia, the concept of Novorossiya, which arose in 2014. What would you say is the, aside from the imperial ambitions which you've described, the actual nature of Russia itself, though, has changed very much within the modern world, you know, in terms of the lack of the rule of law now, the absence of sort of real genuine democratic structures, I suppose a sort of pseudo democratic dictatorship. Would you describe Russia now as basically a sort of emerging or a new fascist country? Would that be a correct way to actually describe where probably Russia is in terms of its concept of, you know, ethno-nationalism and the way in which it operates under Putin?
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not a big fan of using the word fascism loosely, and I wrote a book just now about the Ukrainian organization of Ukrainian nationalists, and in my thing I say, you know, fascism is a kind of an abstract concept, And depending on your definition, the nationalists can either fit or not. And I think it's also true of Russia. So there's a commentator, Alexander Motel. He thinks that Russia is fascist, and he's got his arguments, but it depends on your definition. And I don't think definitions are so important. I don't think name calling is what's important. You have to look at what's happening in that country, and let me preface this by saying that the decline of democratic norms is not limited to Russia. We know that in the Trump presidency, or the convoy escapades in Canada, or the fact that France faces a choice between Macron and Le Pen, that the deterioration of those norms are everywhere. But in Russia, I think what we have to look at is we have a dictatorship which controls the press, mainly television, which is the main source of news for people. Even the internet it controls. And as a result, it is very difficult to formulate an opinion that is independent of what the state is saying. So that is reminiscent of the fascist states, but also of some of the communist states. So, and he probably draws, Russian nationalism has truly fascistic elements to it, and he draws on that. So I wouldn't categorize it as a fascist state because I don't like to use those kind of labels. But I would look at what he does. He invades other countries. He strongly believes in a sphere of influence that is his. He tries to undermine democratic regimes around the world. My feeling is you have to look at actions, intentions, and avoid labels. That's just my perspective.
Thank you, John Paul. Elena, do we have any questions from the chat that you might want to raise at this point?
There is, yeah, someone has just submitted one in the Q&A function, and I think John Paul can see it, and probably you can see it as well, Chris.
Okay.
I can also read it out. I find many people applying the term ethno-nationalism to contemporary Russia. I strongly disagree with that for specific reasons. What's right or wrong with this categorization in your view?
Okay, well, I use the word ethno-nationalism when I'm writing about Ukraine. And I think that the distinction that's trying to be made here is, like in Ukraine, there are two competing programs of identity. One is ethno-nationalism, that is the history and language and culture of the Ukrainian ethnic group should be the hegemonic viewpoint of the entire nation, as opposed to civic nationalism, which is inclusive. There may be Russians, there may be Russian speakers, there are Jews, there are Tatars, it's a civic nationalism. In the way I use it, I feel that Russia is ethno-nationalist. It's not a term I would use all the time because, they do have this kind of separate fiefdom allotted to the Chechens, right? In Chechnya, Kadyrov has his own place. But maybe that is also a sign that that the rest of the country is supposed to be really Russian and should speak the Russian language. It should be the language of international communication. They should all look at certain Russian heroes. And so maybe it's not, maybe civic nationalism and ethno-nationalism in Russia are not as differentiated as programs as they are in Ukraine. but I don't know. The question said they have their own reasons. I'd like to hear those reasons if it's possible.
Can we call in?
Gregory has said that he will be happy to speak, so
Yeah, I'd like to know because it's hard to answer a question that.
sure. Okay, well, Gregory, if you want to speak now.
Hello. Uh, I'm not sure if I can turn my camera on, but okay, it doesn't matter. Hi, Jean-Paul. Very nice to hear your presentation. It's thorough and it's captivating. So I have a kind of an issue with that particular term because to me, Russia is precisely not ethno-nationalist. Russia is Russo-centric imperialist. So you have this kind of Russian centrism, you know, it's kind of Russian supremacist, Russian supremacist imperialism. So everybody can be a Russian, irrespective of your nationality, and they still work with this idea of nationality rather than nation, you know, ethnicity, which is what really that term is. So long as you adopt the ways of the Russian nation, which of course is also not even defined in purely ethnic terms. It is defined in terms of orthodoxy often, although there is a toleration of Muslims, there's a toleration of other types of sort of minor religions, they would call them. It's about the acceptance of a particular Russian civilization, which is essentially, you know, this kind of centralist government, you know, imperial, the supremacy of the imperial ruler, that way of life. So to me, it's kind of Russian supremacist, so long as you accept all of that type of stuff, which certainly does emanate from Moscow. You know, it's the Muscovite style, and a lot of the things that are to do with, you know, Moscow, Russian particular brand of orthodoxy, destiny, you know, this kind of manifest destiny and so on. So that's kind of why I don't think it's ethno-nationalism in that classic sense.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. I have to agree with you, Gregory. In fact, I was trying to emphasize something like that. There's nothing, you know, the purpose is not to be anti-Ukrainian in this. As long as Ukrainians adopt that kind of Russian way, nothing will happen to them. It's not like the persecution of certain ethnic groups, let's say, of African Americans in the United States or indigenous peoples in Canada. Normally, what it is assimilate. You know, there are people in the Russian armed forces, officers who are of Ukrainian origin. There are people in the Kremlin who are of Ukrainian origin, but they have Russified. That's a point I was trying to make. But sometimes it gets out of hand. I have to say that. So you get a moment like the collectivization famine in 1932-33, the man-made famine. Partially it was directed against Ukrainian nationalism, Ukrainian separatism. We know that that's what Stalin had in mind. But after a while, it just became against Ukrainians, no matter what their political views were, because all kinds of people starved in the famine, and Ukraine got the worst of it. And now you can see the Russian army in Ukraine. Supposedly, they're the friends of the Russophone Ukrainians, but they're killing mainly them. So it's a slippery slope. It's a slippery slope. You can be us.
Yeah, I think if I could just add this one thing, I think it's particularly dangerous for Ukrainians, much more so than for Chechens or Buryats or other sort of smaller nations in Russia, because there's just so many similarities or supposed similarities there that you really have to, as a Ukrainian, you have to accept it. You have to accept being Russian, because the issues are going to be minor in the eyes of the Russian, right? They're not going to treat Ukrainians as, oh, well, you know, he's a buryat. He's, oh, well, that's fine. They're kind of, you know, in this typical Russian way, they're of lesser worth. They're, you know, they could be Russian, but we can allow them to have a certain space. Ukrainians cannot be allowed that kind of space. They, because any element of expression of difference is threatening, you know, threatening to the Russians for their project, and so that's why it's more dangerous for Ukrainians. That's why I think that they're so keen on erasing and annihilating Ukrainians, you know, almost genocidally, which is what
I think they also want to do it before it becomes too late.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, John Paul. I'm just going to call in another one of our panelists to ask a question, which is Angela.
Sorry, everybody. I think I'm coming at it from the other end. So first of all, thank you, John Paul. That was really, really useful. When I was reading some of the things that you'd written, like you say, it's exceptionally difficult to condense Ukrainian history into the space of half an hour. But what I was thinking was more from the, you know, so reading through the history, you see Poland, Lithuania, Commonwealth, then you see Austria, you know, Austria mincing in for a bit of action on it, and Austria-Hungary, and, you know, and then, you know, bits being taken by Russian imperialism throughout. So it's all about conquest with different powers. And I just wondered how that, you know, how that shaped modern Ukrainian identity, because I suppose in a way we only had to put up with English, but Ukrainians seem to have everybody wanting a wee bit of them. And I just wondered that, you know, you know, and also I can't remember if it was yourself, John Paul, or someone else that I'd read that said that Ukraine was a nation without a state, which was also like Scotland, Wales, whatever. But I mean, our situation didn't seem to be anywhere near as brutal and sort of up close as that. And I'm just wondering, is being Ukrainian an ethnic identity? Is it something broader than that? So I know that you talked about culture and enlightenment and what have you. And it was just to ask what you thought about that.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a cultural identity. You know, there's a language, there's a literature. Like, I live in Canada, and I was born in the United States, but, you know, I read detective novels in Ukrainian. We're going to celebrate the Ukrainian Orthodox Easter. We taught our children Ukrainian. You know, it's a separate culture that doesn't make sense perhaps to all Russians, because it comes from really very different roots because of that Polish experience, because of the submerged nature of the Ukrainian nation within other polities without state. You know, it's about as different. I would say the languages are about as different, maybe more different than Dutch and German. And there's religious differences. There's quite a, you know, there's a separate literature and music in the Ukrainian language by Ukrainian composers. It may be a smaller culture given the fact that it was submerged for so long, but it's a very interesting culture. And even the submerged culture, the one that was the culture of the serfs, where the church was basically all made out of wood, and craftsmen painted it, and so on. Even that culture is sophisticated and interesting in the way that many plebeian cultures are. Just like, you know, the culture of the slaves is very interesting. Cultures of many submerged peoples are very interesting. Ukrainians have a separate culture, some of it highly sophisticated, some of it really recalling all our peasant roots. When we're going to go on Sunday, we're going to bless our Easter baskets, and it's going to be filled with the same things that our ancestors hundreds of years ago would have put in that basket. It's just the way we do it. And not all countries do the same thing as we do. Not all nations do the same as we do. It's just, it's no different than being Italian. Well, it's different than being Italian in some ways, because the Italians were a forged nation made out of submerged nations, right? Because they had many different dialects. France is there were the Bretons and others in France. There's the Catalans in Spain, the Scots in Britain, still asserting their culture, trying to make it political, but they existed as cultures, well, as far back as you can trace it. Oh, you need is there.
Thank you, John Paul. Angela, is there anything you'd like to add on that?
They give me 10 minutes to learn how to work the unmute button. Just more on that. Just, you're talking about language and how different Russian is to Ukrainian. It struck me that a lot of the news and a lot of people on the left have criticised and said, oh, well, Russia are just standing up for their own culture. That's why they've invaded. That seemed to distort history a bit, because it's my understanding that there's been criticism that the Russian language is banned in Ukraine, but as far as I'm aware, it was Ukraine. It was the Ukrainian language that was heavily banned in Russia. So what one's the truth, in a way, and just a bit why the Ukrainian language question is so important for Ukrainians, either in the past or in the present.
Okay, that's a good and interesting question. After the first invasion of 2014, the restrictions have been put on the Russian language in Ukraine and on all the minority languages in Ukraine, and that is because as long as a huge percentage of the country, like maybe 75% of the country, well, maybe that's too high, speaks Russian in their daily life. The cities, except for the Western Ukrainian city of Lviv, I've never been to another Ukrainian city that spoke mainly Ukrainian. Mainly the languages of the cities are Russian. But when the threat came from Russia in 2014, there was some feeling among, especially among the more nationalistic Ukrainians, that the Russian language should be reduced in its influence in Ukraine. I want to say that the language is not banned for speaking, but it's being pushed out. And the reason is that the Russophone population, the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine, has often been the target of propaganda, anti-Ukrainian propaganda from Russia. And in 2014, there was a more sizable number of people in Ukraine who opposed the Euromaidan, who wanted closer relations with Russia. In many cities, there were Russian activists who tried to take over or succeeded in taking over municipal buildings. And so the idea was to try to wean the population from the Russian language so they wouldn't be exposed so much to Russian TV and so that they would get a feeling of separate identity. It's social engineering.
Can I ask an additional question onto that, John Paul?
Sure.
I mean, living in Wales, obviously the language issue, we have similar issues in terms of the role, the preservation, the overwhelming nature of a small number of, whether it's Russian language, English language, Chinese, and so on. So that's one sort of particular aspect. But one of the things that worries me is the way in which the term ethnic Russian has been used. Because if we were to apply that, for example, to Wales, I would never dream of referring to the sort of 40% of people in Southeast Wales who speak mainly English and have probably origins going back to generations in English as ethnic English. They are Welsh people. It was because nearly everybody has some form of immigrant status. It's just a question of how far back you go. Do you think the term ethnic Russian has become one that's now been abused or weaponized in a way?
Well, I don't know. The Soviets, they gave identification papers to everybody, and on it you had to list your nationality. And there were rules to the kind of how you could choose what nationality you were. You had to follow the nationality of at least one of your parents. And then there was some choice if you came from a mixed marriage. But there, the ethnicity was very important. And in much of Eastern Europe, these kind of ethnic differences remained salient for quite a while. So most tragically, of course, was the Jewish identity during the Second World War, right? It wasn't a religious thing, it was an ethnic identity. So there are these ethnic identities which seem to count more in Eastern Europe than they count here. They count in the Western world, where we have much more, I would say, much more of a mix. Certainly in Canada, it's very hard to even imagine what an ethnic Canadian is, except perhaps the Indigenous people. So ethnic Russians are people who chose, now, because here's the difference. When Ukraine took its first census, it did not base the census on the identification paper nationality. You simply declared what nationality you were. So when people declared themselves Russian, they were declaring themselves ethnic Russian. But many Jews, many Russians just said they were Ukrainian by nationality. And then we look at the statistics and say, oh my God, so many Jews have left, so many Russians have left. In fact, no, not so many have left. They've just, now that they're free to choose their identity, they just say they're Ukrainian. But there are some who insist on an ethnic Russian identity. Among the Russians, certainly, and who use that concept. And I think it makes some kind of sense to talk about ethnic Russians. I mean, in the sense as it makes sense to talk about any kind of ethnicity, although I think we're moving into a world where I hope there's a little bit less of that.
I'm just going to call one more question, then we're going to go back to the chat, and that was from John Maloney. Okay.
Thanks so much. In one sense, it actually follows on from what colleagues have been talking about. Whether you describe them breakaway or natural republics in the Donbass, I'm just interested in historically, linguistically, ethnically, whatever terminology is correct, is whether in one sense those republics are based upon a separate identity. Clearly, in some ways, no. Obviously, there was an imposition of Russian force on those areas, and they were declared republics. But nevertheless, outside of Ukraine, there is an impression that somehow those peoples, if I can use that word, are ethnically or linguistically distinct from the rest of Ukraine. And I just want to say, find out whether historically you think that's correct, in one sense, when the Ukraine was being, if you like, created, they were a leftover, as in so many parts of Eastern Europe. You see a mixture of peoples from different empires, different countries who have got amalgamated into not artificial countries, but if you like, new countries, whether they are in that sense a Russian enclave, a genuine one, or is it literally a political construct that the Russian state has actually just designated those areas as Russian enclaves? And in fact, if you like, linguistically or ethnically or politically, there is literally no substance to those republics. And the last one of those republics is if they do have a real sense that they have some sort of distinction between them and the rest of Ukraine, in other words, if they're not completely artifists, is whether or not a federated solution is correct for the Ukraine. Because obviously, clearly, you know, that there's certainly a move in Britain now to, and certain unions, as I understand it, to try to resurrect the Minsk agreement to say somehow, you know, that the republics do represent distinct identities in Ukraine, and that if there is going to be a peace settlement, there must be a recognition implicitly somehow in a federated way of those republics. So I know it's a very complicated, probably it's a complicated answer, but nevertheless, I would be interested in having an answer to that, please.
Thank you, John.
Okay, now there are definitely differences between the Donbas republics and other parts of Ukraine, but I have to say that many parts of Ukraine are very different one from another. Crimea was had a very large ethnic Russian, in the sense, especially of people who moved from Russia, who were privileged in the old Soviet regime, who could then afford to move to Crimea, which is like, you know, the Florida and Southern California of that part of the world. And it was the most Russophone of the, you know, Russian speaking of any area of Ukraine. So it was clearly very different, and different for a lot of other reasons. The Donbas was has a couple of things that differentiate it from the rest of Ukraine. For one thing, it's a rust belt. It's a place where people are mining and metallurgy, you know, and it has different interests than, say, rural Western Ukraine, or the South, which the steppe, which produces wine, and you know, every part of Ukraine is a little different, and that's really true. And the Donbass was always different. They played important roles at various times, even within the Ukrainian polity. They've had strikes. They've been on different sides over the last 30 years. Where there were some more acute differences was the Donbass had a president of Ukraine, and that was Viktor Yanukovych, who was president of Ukraine from 2010 until he was chased out of the country in 2014. Now, Yanukovych came from the Donbass, and much of the people he worked with came from the Donbass. So for a while, Donbass controlled the state. And they didn't say, oh, we're Donbass, we're not Ukrainian. They were quite, you know, they were their kind of Ukrainian. When they were chased out by the Euromaidan, probably the place, no, not probably, definitely the place that was most anti-Euromaidan, most anti-revolution of dignity was precisely the Donbass, because it was their president and their guys who were kicked out. So yeah, you know, that has to be taken into consideration. Then I think more important than even that, that maybe explain the special resistance and success of the Russian separatist movement. But they were part of a much larger plan in 2014. Don't forget, Kharkiv in the east and northeast was barely saved by preemptive actives of the Ukrainian government from being taken over by pro-Russian separatists. Dnipropetrovsk at that time was also a place where there was serious attempts by Russian separatists to take the city. Odessa was another one. In fact, a number of the Russian separatists died in a fire during the confrontation. The original plan was to have, Putin's plan, was to have a Russian Spring, which created a territory which he called Novorossiya, which has a historical root, which would go from Kharkiv all the way across the Donbass, all the way through the south and reach up to Pridnestrovye in Moldova. So that did not succeed in all the places where it was planned to succeed. It succeeded in the eastern part of the two Donbass oblasts. So it's kind of fluky that it took off there. And I have to say that the kind of government that was put in these separatist republics really discouraged that Russian Spring. Nobody wanted to be ruled by sort of militarized thugs. So yeah, there are differences, but there are lots of differences in Ukraine. Transcarpathia, large Hungarian minority, as Central European as you can get. People go regularly to Hungary to work. Lots of them actually have Hungarian passports now, quite different than the rest of Ukraine. Odessa is an enclave to itself, largely thinks of itself as a kind of center of Russian culture, but there was also a strong Ukrainian movement there, even from the last century. So these places are different, and why those two republics should be recognized and given federation is primarily the reason why Ukraine is reluctant to do that is because they're supposed to get under the Minsk agreements a certain veto power. And since those republics are totally 100% controlled by Russia, Ukraine would be giving up its sovereignty if it allowed Russia to have veto power over its internal politics and foreign politics. So I don't think that that's a good solution. I believe in an inclusive Ukraine. I don't think that any group should be discriminated against. And actually under Ukrainian law, Russians, Tatars, Poles, whoever, Jews have equal rights. But I don't think that Donbass stands out, let's say, more than Dnipro or Kharkiv or any other place in Ukraine. I mean, now it does, thanks to 8 years of war. But otherwise, no.
Elena, can we take some questions from the chat, please?
Sure, and I've collected quite a few of them, so hopefully we'll be able to cover a lot. Elizabeth asks, I think, a very pertinent question for all of us on the left, really. How do we effectively respond to the issue of the far right in Ukraine without actually doing Putin's work for him? And I'll just list a couple of others as well. Peter asks, what would be the consequences of the rise of Ukrainian nationalism as a result of Russian invasion? And there are a few more, I think, historically minded questions as well. Justin asks, would you say that the Chechens serve a similar role as the Tatars did up until Catherine II? And then Connor asks, what can you tell us a bit more about the different diaspora communities, the different communities of Ukrainians around the world, and the moments where big movements, waves of movements happened? So pretty much everything is
Yeah, I
in there.
hope I got them all. I'll start with the one on the far right.
Mm.
There are, as I see it, two problems of the far right in Ukraine. One has been, particularly under the presidents Viktor Yushchenko and Petro Poroshenko, a glorification of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists and of the Ukrainian insurgent army. I feel that this is, has been a really wrong policy. I've opposed it as much as I can as a citizen living in Canada, because these were Holocaust perpetrators who killed large numbers of Jews, tens of thousands of Poles, Russians, POWs. They were mass murderers, and I think you have to really, really draw the line before you can glorify these people. It's bad enough what happened. We should regret what happened, not glorify these murderers. So I feel that's a problem. Then there are the neo-fascists in Ukraine. Azov is mentioned usually. It's a battalion. I don't know how important it is, but I know that there's some popular support among more nationalistically inclined Ukrainians. It's got a civilian wing that is it sometimes engages in anti-minority actions, anti-LGBT actions, those kind of things. There are other smaller right-wing groups. How do we effectively talk about it? I think that we just have to admit what happens and be honest about it. But I don't think that we should be necessarily concentrating on it either. So let's take, for instance, Azov. If it's 900 members, right? The Proud Boys probably have 6,000 in the United States. No member of the far right has been in a contest for the presidential runoff, like is happening in places like France. No members of the far right engaged in as much, what's the word I'm looking for? Not destruction, but damage as the convoys here in Canada, the trucks of the far right. So, let's face it, democracy is undergoing deterioration. The far right is gaining. And what we have to do is stand up for what we consider to be correct. And, I'm not going to stop or I don't agree with Israel's policies as well. Let me put it that way. I still go to these places. I don't invade them. I'll discuss their problems. And I think the same has to be done with Ukraine. Over focusing on it makes it sound like all Ukrainians are fascists, which is simply not the case. It's absolutely incredibly wrong. It's, there are probably more real fascists in the United States per capita than in Ukraine. What will happen to nationalism after the invasion? Well, my crystal ball doesn't work, so I can't actually answer that one. But I wouldn't be surprised if if Putin has managed to move Ukraine so far towards like NATO, and has made heroes of battalions like Azov. What is this war going to do? What is this war going to do? I worry. War leaves deep, deep wounds that last a long time. If in some respects, we're still fighting World War II. Putin tells his people that the denazification is they're going to finish the job that their grandfathers started in 1945. That's the kind of thing war does. You're fighting it and you're fighting it and you're fighting it and you're fighting it. What it does to the mind of people is terrible. I'm reading a book now, Wielka Trwoga by Marcin Zaremba. It's in Polish. It's about what the war did to the attitudes, emotions, moral codes, Weltanschauung of the Poles after World War II. It's just terrible what war does. So, on the Chechens and Tatars, I can't really answer. I don't see that they're so analogous, but obviously the person who asked that question has analogies that would probably be very interesting. On the diaspora communities. Right now, the diaspora communities, well, let me go through that quickly. This first wave of diaspora communities comes from before World War I. And that was largely to North America, to the United States and Canada. These were people who became the miners, laborers, dishwashers, washerwomen, domestic servants in the cities of America. Some of them in Canada became farmers. They were generally speaking a very progressive immigration that reflected the kind of liberal or socialist viewpoints that were dominant in Ukrainian society at the time. Very many of the laboring people who came over were pro-Bolshevik when the revolution broke out. They actually filled the ranks of communist parties and things, and eventually just assimilated into into Canadian society and maybe to the Ukrainian Canadian society. I come from that immigration. I mean, my grandparents did. And then another really major immigration came after World War II, and that was to Britain, Australia, to the English-speaking countries, basically. Canada, the United States, some in Germany, some in France, but basically to the English-speaking countries. And this was dominated by people fleeing from the Soviet rule. In that immigration, and in the first one, it was mainly people from Western Ukraine. Mainly people from Western Ukraine. Not entirely, but mainly. And many of those who came over after the war, especially of the intelligentsia, had been one way or another compromised by working with the Nazi occupation authorities. And therefore, there hasn't been like a real reckoning with the history of the Holocaust or the crimes of the nationalists in this group. And right now, they kind of run the organized life of the Ukrainian diaspora. But there are also now a brand new wave of Ukrainians coming from independent Ukraine. And they are a pretty interesting bunch. Some of them are also rabid nationalists, and others are extremely progressive people. Well, I live in a Ukrainian co-op, housing co-op here in Edmonton, Alberta. And, we've had three couples, gay couples move into our co-op. Some of them are the LGBT community leaving Ukraine because of not so much persecution by the state, but persecution by the right and persecution by society. Leftists have been leaving Ukraine. There's all kinds of interesting younger Ukrainians who are coming into the diaspora now. And they have views that range widely from the extreme right to the extreme left. And they don't oversimplify Ukraine because they know exactly what it is. They've lived there. So they don't have this idealized version of many of the others of us in the diaspora who don't really know Ukraine. I actually know Ukraine pretty well, I would say, but most of us don't. I have the language, I've traveled there often. So that's what our diaspora is like. It tends to be more nationalistic than Ukraine, than Ukrainians in Ukraine. And sometimes it's embarrassingly so. I'm sure you find that in Britain.
I'm going to call one for a question from Paul Inglis, if that's okay. Paul, can you
come? Sure. I have probably just a cluster of some questions, just a few, just a couple of historical ones, because I'm very interested just in, I was very interested in the piece you wrote as well on 10 turning points. So how is the sort of period of indigenization, during the Soviet Union in the 20s seen today in Ukraine? Is it seen as a kind of a failed experiment, or an era where there was some cooperation between Russia and Ukraine that worked? And was there a similar kind of free period of expression for Crimean Tatars as well? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. I have to just talk to my wife for a second. Hold on.
No. Should I continue or?
Yeah, just one moment, Paul. Apologies.
You'll see it. I just need to charge my computer because I'm gonna disappear in a minute. But go ahead. Yeah, more question?
I'm a little bit curious about what ended up happening to the Ukrainian Cossacks, because of course there was the Don and Cuban Cossacks in kind of Russian territory. Are they related to the Ukrainian Cossacks in any way, or are they distinct? And finally, because I've noticed that the sort of exiles of the Belarusian protest movement have ended up getting quite involved in the Ukrainian war effort and joining different militias. And they're kind of seeing the Ukrainian war as a kind of a continuation of the struggle in Belarus. Are there any links between kind of the progressive movements in Ukrainian history with progressive movements in Belarusian history? And so those are my questions.
Okay. Yeah, the period of indigenization, that like 6-year period, it's very, very interesting. That used to be, let's say when Ukraine first became independent or was moving towards independence, that was the big theme in literary magazines, newspapers, historical journals, all these national communists who had done such, experimental theater, experimental films, but with time, I would say Ukraine moved to a more nationalist program, and they, the national communists were relegated to the background. I'll tell you a personal experience I had. I went to Ukraine, I think 89, 90, something like that, and I read a paper on Roman Rozdolsky, who was a Ukrainian Marxist, founder of the Communist Party of Western Ukraine, very keenly aware of the national question. I wrote the article, and because I was a young professor, I was trying to get proof that it would be published. So I asked Zoltan magazine, which is the October magazine, if it accepted it, and they wrote down that they accepted my article. But they never published it because the train that carried the national communists into the imagination of Ukrainians left the station, and instead they began writing about the nationalist movement and about the battles for independence in 1917, 18, and 19. So I would say there was a moment when there was a real interest in the 1920s in Soviet Ukraine. But I think that moment passed. And, except in certain circles that have been very interested in their contribution to Ukrainian culture. Cossacks. The Don Cossacks are different. than the Cossacks that I mentioned, but not entirely. There were certainly Ukrainian Cossacks who merged with the Don Cossacks as well. The Kuban Cossacks are Ukrainian Cossacks. They just moved to that part of the world. So there are links among all the Cossacks, but the Ukrainian Cossacks basically they did disappear as a phenomenon at the end of the 18th century, while the Don Cossacks, the Yait Cossacks, and other Cossacks continued, as we know, into the 20th and even the 21st. On Ukrainian and Belarusian issue, I have seen very little cooperation between the Belarusians and the Ukrainians historically. Maybe I should reframe that. When both Ukraine and Belarus were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, they shared a common religious culture. But when the national awakenings occurred in the 19th century, I don't see much correspondence between these people at all, between Ukrainian and Belarusian awakeners. Ukrainian awakeners started earlier, the Belarusians were much later. The Ukrainian awakeners were based at universities. Belarus didn't even have a university. So it was very hard to make any connections. And now, I would say, since independence, I've met a number of Belarusians who are taking the Ukrainians really as kind of an example of sticking up for a separate culture. But earlier, I didn't see much at all.
Thank you, John Paul. Thank you, Paul. We're just going to move on to ask our comrade from Kiev, Vladislav, to just talk a bit about the importance of the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign. And we're going to ask a couple of comrades to talk about that too. I just want to say thank you very much for all the people who've participated and attended. This meeting was organised by the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, and we would like to just inform you a bit more about it and also why we think you should support the campaign. So, Vladislav, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Firstly, thank you for John Paul for such an interesting overview of Ukrainian history and something about Ukrainian identity. It was really pleasant to hear such attention to Ukraine, especially from John Paul, who is pretty popular in the Ukrainian discussions of history. You can see everyone talking about his books like every time on Facebook if you're engaged in the Ukrainian history community, mostly in negative way, but yeah, I'm glad to hear you. Thank you a lot. And about Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, I want to stress two things. First, generally, Ukraine at the moment needs all support that it can get. It's in a very dangerous and in very hard situation, and everyone in every country should unite to the cause of helping Ukraine, to helping Ukrainian refugees, to helping Ukraine in future to rebuild, to have a possibility to defend against Russian invasion via sending weapons, via supporting weapons, via supporting any means that can strengthen Ukrainian defense. Some people talks about pushing diplomatic solutions and so on. Especially, it's strange to see some such talks on the left, because I think people on the left, especially these that are engaged with the working class, should know that you cannot have any diplomatic solution without power. When you're organizing trade unions or organizing in working class, you just don't talk with the boss one-on-one, but talk when you have a trade union and people behind you. The same situation here. Not any diplomatic solution isn't possible when Ukraine don't have power and support and solidarity from every way it can get. And second part is especially about the left. This is why we should support it generally, all the people. We must unite for supporting Ukrainian struggle. But on the left, there's also important issue, important problems that Ukrainians at the moment see left, especially Western left, and they see what they're answering, what they're saying about Ukraine, and they see all of this chauvinism, racism, and talks how about diplomatic solutions, about not giving weapons to Ukraine, and so on and so on. It mainly comes from the far left, and many of these people just seems that the left is that kind of people that are against Ukraine. So that's kind of definition of the left that is developing in Ukraine, seeing all of this, what's going on the Western left. And in this situation, in this blatant racism and chauvinism from the far left against Ukraine, we must have people who can say something different, who can acknowledge that Ukrainians have the right to exist, have the right to self-defense, have the right to be something different from Russians, and have their separate states that can make their decisions without counting with Russian sphere of influence, geopolitics, and so on and so on. And because of this, anyone on the left who are supporting Ukraine now is even more important, because all the support from the left is that support that saying that left is not about racism and chauvinism and anti-Ukrainianism. It's about something different, entirely different. It's about solidarity. It's about social struggle. It's about fighting imperialism and about just having alternative future. So it is why important on the left to talk about this, even more than generally, because the left has a kind of responsibility, and all the left has not only like Ukrainian left, but European left, all the left, and even that people who was pro-Ukrainian also need to voice their opinion a lot more, because of people who saying just like Murray or something like this, saying just absolutely blatantly anti-Ukrainian things, and who are hated towards Ukraine, their hatred towards Ukrainian population hidden by their formulations. But in this war, especially after all these atrocities, nationalism will grow, hatred will grow, and we as the left should support Ukraine to prevent such situations, to show that not only nationalism is the answer, that socialism and socialist left and just general left can also support Ukraine, can also be the answer to existing problem. And without having this different voices that are for Ukraine, left wouldn't become popular in Ukraine never again. So because it will be felt like something alien, something that against Ukraine. So we must say this very clearly, very loudly, that left also supports Ukraine, supports its struggle, supports anti-imperialism fight without any compromise with the right, nationalists, capitalism, imperialism, and so on. So, and that's why I think Ukraine Solidarity Campaign is very important. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Vladislav, and solidarity from all of us here to you and the comrades in Kyiv and throughout Ukraine. I'm going to ask John Maloney to add to that, please, this message.
Cheers, Chris. I mean, I'm here in a personal capacity I'm not here as the Assistant General Secretary, but nevertheless, I am pleased to report to the meeting that the National Executive Committee today made the decision that it will support a motion going forward to our national conference, which will be in May, which actually is about affiliating to the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign. In fact, we're supporting 3 motions which are straight down the line on the side of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian trade union movement in Ukraine. And it's about basic international solidarity. And I'm pleased to say that from day one, our union has had that position. There has been some discussions about whether our position should be modified with reference to NATO, but our National Executive Committee actually rejected those types of amendments. So we've got a straight up and down 100% support for the Ukrainian people, right to sole self-determination. The reason why I personally find this campaign so important and why I hope our national conference will agree, and certainly I know why the NEC did agree, is not so much political, but actually practical. But when we needed to make contact with the Ukrainian trade union movement, there was an existing campaign that's been in existence since 2014 that we could actually reach out to, that had those contacts, that immediately actually put us in contact with our sister unions in the Ukraine. When the idea of having an event that turned up to be actually supported by 10 national unions, where you've add up the membership, you're talking about heading towards 2 million trade unions were represented by those 10 unions. It was to the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign that we turned to, and who was key in actually helping certainly PCS, but the other unions to coalesce around the event. When we needed to make contact with the federations in Ukraine, again, Ukrainian Solidarity Campaign were the people that actually delivered that. They delivered the media outreach to Kiev. So that people in the Kiev Post, who read the Kiev Post, would actually see there was a demonstration of 10 national unions in favor of self-determination for the Ukrainian people, but also solidarity with the Ukrainian trade union movement. Now, we're hoping again through the campaign that we'll be able to get a speaker either by video or as a recorded message to actually attend our national conference. Our national conference represents heading towards 200,000 workers. And that is, again, only possible through the Ukrainian Solidarity Campaign. So on a personal basis, that's the reason why I support it. It's a wider issue for me. It's about international solidarity, but certainly for my union, certainly the National Executive Committee, that's why we support it. And I hope when we do have the vote that we actually will affiliate and take a full stance with the Ukrainian Solidarity Campaign. And I would urge other unions, either national executives or branches, to put affiliation motions up, have the debate, and it will be a very, and I'll come to an end, it will be a very sharp debate in our conference already today on our National Executive Committee, basically affiliating to the Ukraine Solidarity Campaign became a proxy discussion about NATO. And that actually, if you like, shows something about the left in this country, that actually a straightforward affiliation immediately got diverted into what's your stance on NATO. So it's going to be a sharp debate at conference. And, you know, we may lose the motion. I hope we won't. And if we do pass the motion, then we will take our full throw our full weight behind the campaign. But as I said, it'd be really great if all the other unions did the same, because not only politically, but as a practical proposition, we need to support this campaign.
Thank you very much, John. That's very welcome. And for those who are new here today, if we just say the campaign is currently supported by the National Union of Mine Workers and the Train Drivers Union ASLEV, and I hope very much PCS members will vote to affiliate at the conference. There's also a GMB conference coming up in June, which is General Workers Union. We'll be having a fringe meeting there, and also a representative of the Federation of Trade Unions of Ukraine will be coming from Ukraine and will be addressing that conference in June in Britain, which will be very welcome. I'm just going to ask Paul, who's part of our campaign in Scotland, to say a few words too, if you could, Paul.
Sure. So I think why we need the USC, I mean, put simply, because the Ukrainian people, and especially the Ukrainian working class, need our support in their fight to prevent the occupation of their country by a bandit army. We've seen what the Russian military have done and are doing across the country. We've seen the pitiless carnage, the wanton murder and looting committed by Russian troops in Bucha. And I am sad to say, it is certain that we have not seen the last of such disgraceful barbarism. It is clear what Russian conquest will mean for the civil and political life of Ukraine, because the proof is already in plain evidence. In Russian-occupied Ukraine, public protest and trade union dissent will be met by the harsh rule of the military policeman and the sniper, a regime of summary justice, kidnapping and bullets. The stakes are very high. For Ukrainian workers, it is a question of protecting the simple democratic rights that any labor movement ought to take for granted: the right to protest, the right to organize, the right to strike, the right to free speech. It is a struggle for survival. Any help that we can lend them in that task, through organizing and funding material aid, by publicizing their cause and spreading the word, by placing their demands and help and support before elected representatives, party and trade union branches, and civil society at large, will be of assistance to them. So it is to that end that the USC stands for cooperation between workers here and workers in Ukraine, building direct links with independent socialists in the labor movement over there. You've heard from our friend Vladislav from Socialny Ruch. Well, it's people like him that we are in cooperation with and whose cause we want to help. We're for the right to Ukrainian self-determination, for the right of the Ukrainian people to decide and choose their own path in a world free from intervention and imperialist meddling by the great powers. I will mention a few ways that the USC can help bring about those aims. One very important way the USC can help, that may not suggest itself as obviously as caravans of food and medical supplies, is in amplifying the voice of independent Ukrainian left and trade unions, and showing that yes, there are working class forces in Ukraine, and that they have opinions, ideas, hopes, and goals, that they have views and demands that we can carry forward and advocate. Consider the significance of ideas like the debt amnesty proposed by Socialny Ruch. This is a demand that must be brought into as many settings as possible and fought for at every level of civil and political discourse. Ukraine should not fight a war for survival to only then be asset stripped and economically plundered by creditors eager to profit from the investment opportunities that plague a devastated nation and only ever seem to work out for Wall Street. On the material plane, the USC has been fundraising for mutual aid to the Ukrainian people, things like raising money for medical supplies, for the appeal by the Federation of Trade Unions of Ukraine for money to help house war refugees. They are one part of a great outpouring of public support that has flowed eastwards since the beginning of the war. And of course, the USC have made political interventions, canvassing support for the Ukrainian people in the trade union movement, as you've been hearing about, organizing demonstrations in solidarity with Ukraine, and attending marches and demonstrations to convince and notify the public, to raise money, and to show that the Ukrainian workers have eager and willing comrades abroad. So I say to you, lend a hand. The Ukrainian people are in for a long, grim, arduous ordeal, and solidarity work like this will only become more necessary with every passing day.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's much appreciated to you, John and Vladislav. Just a quick announcement I want to make in terms of activity in London on Saturday, the 30th of April. We're having a joint demonstration with the Russian campaign, Russians Against the War, at the Russian embassy in solidarity with the Russian anti-war movement and with the Ukrainian struggle. It is May Day, so hopefully we will have an alternative London demonstration in London to the Stalin Fest that normally takes place on that weekend. But please do come along and join us at the demonstration at the Russian embassy along with our Russian comrades. I'm going to hand over to you now, John Paul, to conclude the meeting. Perhaps a question I could pose that you could consider is, as you know, there's been memory laws and glorification of certain people in Ukraine. Perhaps you could tell us, who would you glorify?
Well, you know, I'm not a big hero worshiper, but I think there are so many interesting people in Ukraine to honor and to study. So I've been reading Mikhailo Draumanov, the political thinker, almost continuously since, I think, 1970. I have world of respect for his thought. I'm also very interested in Ukrainian Marxist Roman Rozdolsky. Ivan Franko was an absolutely fascinating character. I think that the Ukrainian Galicians who fought for independence deserve to be honored. I think that there are many churchmen in Ukrainian history who are extremely interesting, but who, we don't know much anymore because we're a secular society and the languages are hard to know, these old languages. But there's just, there's a lot there in that Ukrainian culture and a lot that could be celebrated. And maybe for my last words, let me say that I think that Vladislav hit it right on the nail. What should be happening? We should be informing the left about Ukraine and informing Ukraine about the left. We have to give another perspective on you can be defending your country, you can be practicing your culture, and you don't have to be a nationalist to do it. There are larger values, there are important economic values, there are political values that I think have to be held sacred. That's it.
Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight from Canada. It's been fantastic and it's been much appreciated. And thank you, Vladislav. Solidarity from everyone here.
Can I have a few words?
To all the comrades in Ukraine in your struggle. Thank you very much to all the panelists and everyone who participated. Okay, thank you, comrades. Goodbye. Thank you, Lena. Okay.
Can I have a few last words?
Oh, sorry, Vladislav, we ran a bit late. What did you want to say? Something?
Like a few minutes, because what Jean-Paul said is very in Dragomaniev way, I would say, because it was done 200 years ago by also Ukrainian left and European left. There was a person who just talked constantly about Ukrainian problems and pushed this idea. And yeah, it's a very good framework that we need to talk about Ukraine with the left and about the left with Ukraine. And from whom Marx get to know Taras Shevchenko. Also from this Ukrainian leftist Dragomaniev who pushed this idea of plebeian nations and of giving them voice and expressing solidarity. And I think that this is what we should do all together, especially in this hard situation.
Thank you, Vladislav. Thank you. Thank you, Jean-Paul. Okay, now for the dobry.